Welcome to Polar Bears International Tundra Connection Program. It's polar bear season in Churchill, and we are coming to you live from the Tundra Buggy on the shores of the Hudson Bay with Arctic winds and polar bears right outside these windows. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry that we had a couple technical difficulties that got us started a little bit late, but we're here with you now and we are ready to start talking about ecosystems, which is exactly today's topic. And we're not just looking at the ecosystems of the Arctic, but we're looking at ecosystems from all around the world. From right here, outside these windows, on the Hudson Bay ecosystem of Canada and to the Rocky Mountain ecosystem in the United States and the coral reefs of Mexico, Australia, and all around the world. Our target audience for today is classrooms and people just like yourself from all across North America. Our partners for today's program are Explorer.org and members of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums that are Arctic Ambassador Centers. This program will last about 50 minutes and ladies and gentlemen, this is a hugely important part of it. This is not just watching TV. This is a live and interactive event. We're going to be taking you outside this Tundra Buggy in order to show you some pictures of what the Arctic looks like. We're going to be answering the questions that you have posed for us today. And beyond learning about ecosystems, we're going to be talking about how you can help the polar bears and help our planet. And we'd love to hear about what you are doing to increase conservation in your areas locally and globally. Now, how do you participate in today's event? There are 3 different ways. Now, there's a chat window that's on the side of the streaming window that you have. You can email your questions to questions@polarbear.org, or you can send a tweet to #TundraConnections, and we're going to share those throughout the broadcast. And we'll have opportunities, ladies and gentlemen and boys and girls, for you to send in those comments, because your interaction and your participation in today's event is absolutely crucial. Now, my name is Terry Godwalt, and I'm the Director of the Programming for the Center for Global Education, partnering with Taking It Global and PBI to facilitate this event and bring it out to you. As was said earlier, we are coming to you from just outside the town of Churchill, which is a town like many others, with the exception of the months of June from November, where they have some pretty important visitors. They have about 900 people, and those visitors that we're talking about was those polar bears that are coming and joining them for that time there. Now, it's just outside the bay of, it's actually on the Hudson's Bay, which is about 1.5 million square kilometers. Now, those of you from Canada, that's about the size of Alberta and Saskatchewan put together. From the United States, it's about the size of Texas. So it's a pretty big place. And outside of that, ladies and gentlemen, outside of these windows here is the Arctic, and we're joining to you from Tundra Buggy 1. And so you can see there's a picture of a Tundra Buggy right there, and that's what we're driving around on here. And right outside these windows, there's ice and there's snow, and we're going to learn a little bit more about all that ecosystem here later. Now, I have some very special people who are joining me here today, and all the way over on my left, your right, we have Dr. Stefan Peterson. Dr. Stefan Peterson, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Terry. So I'm Dr. Stefan Peterson. I'm head of conservation and research at Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg. And one of the reasons I'm here is my research background has really ranged from everything from fleas and tarantulas all the way up to polar bears and ring seals and bowhead whales. And that's really put me in a great position to work at a zoo where zoos are concerned with conserving a wide diversity of species. So my specialty is population genetics, which may not sound very exciting, but really it's using DNA to learn about different organisms, why they're where we find them, how they might be interacting with one another. So I'm really happy to be part of this connecting ecosystems discussion, because even though my focus is on the Arctic, really the Arctic is connected to everything else in one way or another.
Thank you so very much, Stefan. And now let's meet our next guest. We have Elisa McCall.
Hi everybody, my name is Elisa McCall, and I'm the Field Programs Manager at Polar Bears International right now. I've been studying polar bears since 2010, and I studied these polar bears right outside our window right now. So this is the western Hudson Bay polar bear population. And my research with these polar bears looked at a lot of their movements and their distribution on sea ice, which we find with the GPS collars. And I really love doing research in this area because it's a combination of several different ecosystems coming together. So we have the Hudson Bay marine environment, we have the boreal forest that's just a little bit south of here, and we have the tundra that we're on right now. So the tundra doesn't have many trees, doesn't have a lot of plant growth, and it's pretty cold. But we have these 3 different ecosystems kind of coming together in this one region, and it's just this really neat mix of plants and animals, and it's really fun to be here and do research here.
Thank you so very
Thanks,
much,
Terry.
Lisa. And let's go across to Dr. Jennifer Kay.
Hi, so I'm Jen Kay. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado. And my specialty is climate, and in particular Arctic climate. So I study the clouds, the sea ice, how the system here is connected to the rest of the planet. And one of the tools that I use is a global climate model. And we'll be talking a little bit later in the broadcast about what global climate models show and kind of what we might expect for the future of ecosystems and climates on the planet.
Thank you so very much, Jen. Now, like I said earlier, ladies and gentlemen, this is an interactive event. So not only do we want you to share questions you might have for us, but what we would love is to know a little bit about you. We want to know about your ecosystems. So if you have a picture, or even you just want to write where you are in the world and what ecosystem happens to be right outside your back door. So before we get into ecosystems around the world, let's learn a little bit about ecosystems right here. So I'll pass it over to Stefan again to tell us about what is an ecosystem.
Yeah, so ecosystems are all around us, but they're kind of hard to define. So in a general sense, we can think about them as a collection of plants and animals and organisms that are all kind of connected to one another and experiencing the same sort of environmental conditions. So the same sort of weather on the short term and climate on the long term. And so on the simplest thing, you could probably think about maybe a home aquarium as being a really small ecosystem that maybe consists of, your goldfish and a few snails and maybe a plant. And then you can scale that up, so you can think about the ecosystem in your city or even around your city, or you can think of ecosystems like the Arctic, or on even a bigger scale, you can think of the planet as one big interconnected ecosystem.
Thank you, Stefan. Now, let's learn about some of the ecosystems that are actually where you guys find yourselves. So now one of the schools joining us today is Our Lady of Evergreens from Calgary. Hello, Our Lady of Evergreens. And they're joining us from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So tell us, Elisa, what's a little bit about the ecosystem that they would find themselves in the midst of?
Sure. So I actually live in Edmonton right now, but I love coming down to visit Calgary. You guys have such a neat mix of ecosystems there. So right in your backyard, you have the mountains, and in the mountains you find all sorts of neat animals. You've got elk and deer, and you've got different bears. You've got all sorts of birds. You've got all sorts of plants. You've got the deciduous trees, the coniferous trees, a lot of flowers. You've got alpine meadows. It's just so neat. And then you also have the prairies right there. So that's a lot of the grasses, smaller bushes, a lot of different birds, a lot of small mammals, voles, mice, things like that. And within these different ecosystems, you might find different animals, but they're all kind of working together in this food web. And it's so cool. And I would encourage you guys to really take a look in your backyard and see what you see out there, and when maybe you go on a weekend trip for a picnic somewhere else, see if you can find anything different that lives, in the mountains than maybe if you're in the prairies usually. So yeah, keep an eye out for the different stuff you guys see around Calgary, because it is just a really neat mix of things going on there.
Absolutely, it is such a beautiful place. Now, ladies and gentlemen, so we talked about Calgary and mountains. We're going to be talking about the Arctic later on, but ecosystems don't just exist on land, they also exist in the water. And we are so very fortunate to have joining us today Mr. Enriquez's class from Mexico. And I know in Mexico they have some pretty cool coral reefs. Stefan, could you tell us about the ecosystems and coral reefs?
Yeah, so one of the most diverse groups of organisms are all clustered around coral reefs. So they're living in the marine environment, and there's coral reefs that you think about that are full of beautiful fish and in tropical places, but there's also coral reefs further north and in deeper water that no one really sees or understands as well, because they're not as fun to snorkel at and not as fun to do research there.
Thank you, Neil.
But coral reefs are incredibly sensitive and incredibly
You're welcome,
diverse.
number
There's
11.
so many different kinds of corals, so many different kinds of little invertebrates like shrimp and fishes, and then the big marine predators that feed off those, so sharks and rays. Great places, amazing
Absolutely.
places, and very fragile as well.
Huh.
But we'll learn about that a bit
Very,
later.
very much so. Ladies and gentlemen, whether we're talking about ecosystems like the mountains or the Arctic, or we're talking about an ecosystem which could be something as small as an aquarium that you have in your own house, these are all ecosystems, and they're all very much ours in the world to share. Now, so we've talked about ecosystems. I would like to now bring you to where we find ourselves, which is the Arctic ecosystem. So, Stefan, could you tell me a little bit about the Arctic ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So we've been kind of emphasizing the land that we're on right now, but a big part of the Arctic ecosystem is actually in the marine environment. It's in the ocean, and it's really the ice that has driven that and formed it. And what we see around us is largely because of animals and plants that are living under the ice or on the ice. So if we think about that ecosystem, we can think kind of at the bottom of the food chain, we have algae, we have phytoplankton, we have little organisms in the water, but not only in the water, some of them live right in the ice as well. And then we can think of kind of the next level up in the food chain about fishes that are, some of them also live in little channels in the ice. And those are food for bigger fishes and for seals. And then those seals are food for even bigger predators. And the one that we're really excited about today is polar bears. But at the top of that Arctic food chain, we also have people, and we're seeing some new predators like killer whales. But really, they're all tied together by the ice, and the ice that forms on the Arctic Ocean and in Hudson's Bay.
Absolutely. So that's an ecosystem we have here, and Fies on the Fly has sent in a note that they are from the Renaissance walled city of Lucca, Italy. Boys, oh boys, you guys are a long ways away. And it is a mix of urban, some wetland, and the edge of a forested mountain ecosystem. And Little Flower School in Indianapolis is also joining us, so we'd love to learn a little bit about your ecosystem there as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much, Fives on the Fly and Little Flower, for sending in your comments and your tweets. And we'd like to encourage all of our other students and individuals as well who are joining us. Send in your questions or comments, questions@pbears.org. Send in your tweets to #TundraConnections, and send in your comments on the side of the chat window. That's right on the site that you're joining us there for today. Okay, ecosystems, Arctic ecosystems. Now let's learn a little bit. These are ecosystems that some of them are at risk and that we need to take special concern about. Jen, could you tell us a little bit about this and how what we might need to be concerned about?
Sure, Terry. So I'll pick up on a theme that Stefan had, which is the importance of sea ice in the Arctic. Many of you might not know what sea ice is. So sea ice is just when the ocean freezes. So many of you have probably been to the beach, you've seen the waves coming in. So just take that all into a really cold environment and it freezes, and then you can have polar bears walking around on it, and polar bears can be on it hunting seals. So part of the ecosystem up here. So what's interesting is we've seen some changes in sea ice. So we have observations from satellites since about the time that I was born, so in the late 1970s. And those observations have shown a lot less sea ice in the Arctic than when I was born. So in 2012, that was the record minimum for sea ice in the Arctic, and there was about half of the sea ice that was around when I was born. So what does that mean? Well, lots of changes for the ecosystem, but also for people too. You know, there's people taking boats up and down the Northwest Passage, which you'll see on your screen right now, which is this fabled passage that connects the Arctic Ocean to the North Atlantic. So some pretty big changes going on up here in the Arctic.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about ecosystems, we're talking about the Arctic, which is on the ocean. What about ocean ecosystems?
Yeah, so we had talked a little bit about coral reefs, and maybe another thing that might be causing some risks is, so the warming that we're seeing is in large part a result of increased carbon dioxide in our atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. So when you increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you also increase carbon dioxide in the ocean, and that makes the ocean more acidic. Think lemon juice.
I like lemon juice, but it's a little bit sour.
Do you like to swim in lemon juice?
Oh no, I don't think I would like to swim in lemon
I
juice.
mean, it's not quite as extreme as that, but it's really not great for the organisms in the ocean. So you can have shells dissolving and coral reefs, you know, another species ecosystem that can really be in trouble.
Yeah, so Stefan, you were telling us about coral reefs. What impact does that have for the animals that are living there?
Yeah, so you can think about living in a little bit more acidic water, a little bit more lemon juice. It's not good, and that's not the only impact. So coral reefs are really sensitive to the conditions, not only how much carbon dioxide and how much acid is in that water. That has big implications on kind of the base of that food chain, the ability for reefs to build and grow over time is reduced as that water gets more acidic. We also know that there's been changes in the level of the sea, and so because coral reefs kind of have this optimum water depth that they live in, when you change that water level, it also changes where that optimum kind of place to be for coral reef organisms actually is. So it's a big impact on that their optimum is no longer where they are living, and they're solid structures. They can't move to these new structures really easily, if at all. So the whole ecosystem of a coral reef can be impacted by things that you wouldn't really necessarily think would be a problem. A little more water depth, a little more acidity in the water might not seem like a big deal, but for organisms that are so specialized and so adapted to that kind of narrow band of awesome conditions,
absolutely
big impacts.
Well, and so beautiful. You know, I think of all the incredible fish and animals and the beautiful coral reefs that are there. That to risk losing something like that, to me is a little bit scary.
Yeah, and it starts out with the kind of the base of these food chains, but really the ones that people think of at first are the big fishes, the big predators, both in coral reefs. People go to see the fish, and they go to see the sharks, and they're really interested in, if you're living there, on the fish that they can harvest, and that all changes when the base of that food chain changes. Similarly in the Arctic, if that base of that food chain changes, we're going to see changes throughout that whole ecosystem, that whole network.
And I mean, today we're learning about the Arctic ecosystem and about the polar bears that are found therein. And when we're talking about predators, and we may be interested about sharks and those different things in the around the coral reefs, but when we come up here, we're all very interested in the polar bears. Elisa, can you tell us a little bit about some of the risks that these changing ecosystems have on the polar bears?
Definitely. So we've been talking about the Arctic, and the Arctic is a very, very massive place, and we have 19 different subpopulations of polar bears in that Arctic. And a lot of these subpopulations are in slightly different conditions. So there's some polar bears that they live their entire lives on the ice. These polar bears here actually come onto shore in the summer, and that's why we can see them right now, because we're on land, and so are the polar bears. And the polar bears here, they're adapted to that. So historically, so in the past, about when the ice is starting to freeze up, so pretty soon, they'll go out on the sea ice all year and they will eat a lot of seals. And that seal fat that they consume gives the polar bears a lot of body fat. And then when the sea ice melts in Hudson Bay in the summer completely, the polar bears come back on shore and they live off their body fat. And they used to have enough to live, pretty well all summer until it was time to go back out again. Now what we see happening in Hudson Bay is that because of this climate warming, there's a bit more heat in the atmosphere and a bit more heat in the ocean. So if you guys have a really, really cold cup of water and you put some ice cubes in it, the ice is going to stick around a bit longer than if you put ice cubes in a room temperature or lukewarm cup of water. Right? It's just basic. If it's colder, there's more ice around.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is that the sea ice right now, compared to 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it's actually not freezing up until a little bit later in the year. So the polar bears are having to wait longer before they can go eat. And I mean, probably you guys don't like waiting for your lunch an extra hour or two longer.
I can get pretty grumpy if I have
Right.
to wait an hour or two.
And these polar bears are now having to wait several weeks longer, sometimes even longer than that, in bad years. And then what's also happening on the other end is that when it's time to come ashore, that's now happening a little bit earlier. So polar bears are being pushed onto shore a couple weeks earlier than usual. So that's like cutting your lunch hour in half. You're not getting to eat. Well, they're not cutting their entire hunting period in half, but they're getting a little less time to eat, and we don't like that either.
Yeah,
So-
at least, I mean, I can wait for an hour or two, but
Right.
you're talking weeks.
Weeks, yeah.
I mean, how does a polar bear live when it has to last for weeks more time before eating?
Right. So luckily, many polar bears, they have enough body fat to sustain them. But any polar bears that come on shore that haven't been able to get fat enough, they might struggle a little bit, to make it until it's time for their next meal. And so what we're seeing in this population is that over time, polar bears are getting a little bit smaller just because they don't have the energy to convert into body mass. Polar bear mothers actually are having fewer cubs than they used to because it's really hard to sustain a couple babies when food is a little bit scarcer or it's a little bit harder to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing fewer cubs, smaller bears, and we're seeing a reduced population size compared to 40 years ago as well. So there's slightly fewer bears than there used to be in this area too. And we can relate this all to these changing sea ice patterns, which are related to the greenhouse gas emissions and the climate shifting in this region. So we're really concerned about the polar bear, but the sea ice changes are going to affect more than the polar bear. So there's a lot of animals in this region that really need that sea ice. So we have an Arctic fox in this area. Arctic foxes are these super cute little foxes. They're really not that much bigger than your house cat, actually. And they like to follow polar bears out on the sea ice, and they eat polar bear leftovers. And that's a big source of their food, is the sea ice. And so if the sea ice goes, we don't really know what's going to happen to the Arctic fox. And also seals. So we talked about polar bears eating these seals, and they mainly eat ringed and bearded seals. So two species of ice seals, we call them. So these seals, they breed on the sea ice, and they really use the sea ice as part of their life cycle.
Yep.
And so if
Yep.
that sea ice goes, it's also going to affect the seals, which also affects the polar bears. And it's because it's this ecosystem that's all connected through all these different links. And so we're really concerned about the Arctic and this area too.
Absolutely. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear how important ecosystems are? That it's not just a matter of one animal, it's a matter of the whole ecosystem together. So what you're learning in school right now is really important to understand what we have to understand to help the world be a better place. Now, I could ask all of you guys questions all day long, but I know that you boys and girls have some great questions that you would love to ask as well. So I would encourage you right now, check out that chat bar on the side of the web stream, and you'll be able to type in your questions there. Send your questions to us to the email address, which is at questions@pbears.org, or send them through Twitter to the #Tundra Connections. And then we'll be able to ask those questions directly. Now, we have some students from Colorado who have asked some questions to us in this area. Now, can't the polar bears just decide to move off of the land, off of the ice? I mean, they can come and hang out with the grizzly bears and the black bears. So the question specifically was, will polar bears just adapt to a world without ice?
Sure. Well, we don't think they will. In fact, we know that they can't. Polar bears, their Latin name actually means the sea bear. They are so tied to the sea ice in the ocean. Brown bears and black bears are omnivores, just like humans. So we eat a variety of meats and veggies and all sorts of things. Polar bears really are the most carnivorous of bears, and in fact, it's really the fat that they really want to eat. Polar bears eat a ton of fat, and there's just nothing on land that has that amount of fat. When we see polar bears on land right now, they love to eat eggs. They'll eat some caribou if they can find it. They eat berries, they eat kelp, things like that. but none of those food sources really are adding body weight or fat onto a polar bear's body. It's just not how they digest food. And so we know that while some polar bears can find some food on land, there's really not enough calories or enough fat to sustain polar bears long term. And in fact, the grizzly bears that do live in this area, there's very, very few of them, and they're very small. So there's just not enough calories on this landscape. And the adaptation to these specific environments, the specialization, takes place over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And we are changing the climate in merely decades. And polar bears are very long-lived animals. They have long reproductive cycles, so they're not, adding to the population at a fast rate. So they evolve very slowly. And there's just no way, with the way things are going now, that polar bears can adapt to live on land. It would really be a new bear at that point. And we want to maintain polar bears as they are and maintain the sea ice for them and all the other animals that depend on the sea ice that we've talked about.
Absolutely. Guys, boys and girls, don't we love our polar bears?
Oh,
I'll tell you, I love our polar bears, and I love them just the way they are. Thank you very much. Stefan, so let's say something bad happens, and we have fewer and fewer polar bears. Is there an animal that would come in as well? Would the grizzly bear come up here and hang out for a while, or is there another animal that would take their place at the top of that pyramid that you showed us earlier?
Yeah. Well, that's a really great question, and one that lots of researchers are interested in finding out if that's what's going to happen. Because a lot of times we think of, well, if we lose polar bears, then there'll be just this big hole in the ecosystem. But that's not how ecosystems tend to change. They go from one kind of bunch of organisms to a new bunch of organisms. So one of the ones that we're seeing in the Arctic Ocean, in the Canadian Arctic especially, is we're seeing more and more killer whales. So as we change from an ecosystem that normally killer whales wouldn't be able to get into because they're not adapted to the ice as well. They have this big dorsal fin on top that is not good for going through ice. So if you think of the belugas and narwhal and bowhead whales that are ice-adapted whales, none of them have a big dorsal fin to get hung up on the ice and damaged in the ice. So as we lose ice, and we have seen more killer whales coming further into the Canadian Arctic, and that's going to have big changes and big implications for everything, from seals, from all those whales that are adapted to get away from killer whales in the Canadian Arctic. They're not going to have that refuge anymore. And we're going to switch from an ice-dominated and a sea bear, polar bear dominated as our top predator along with humans, to maybe killer whales and humans being the top predators. And don't get me wrong, killer whales are amazing, but kind of like polar bears too.
Amen. Okay, so I have a great question here from Ives on the Fives on the Fly, and Fives has asked, are you finding that female polar bears are having fewer cubs because they're not able to fatten up like they used to? Maybe Alicia from Polar Bears International, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah,
one.
sure. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly right. They just don't have enough weight to really support the same number of cubs that they used to. So we used to see triplets in this population much more often, and now it's quite rare that we find triplets at all. We're seeing a lot more single cubs and twins in this area. We're also seeing a higher proportion of females that never do make it to the body weight where they can support cubs. So there is a threshold of weight at which a polar bear's body can support, producing babies. Just like every mammal, it's the same with humans. Your body needs to be at a certain weight before it can actually produce young. And same with polar bears. So if a females mate in the spring, and they have something called delayed implantation. So they don't actually technically get pregnant until the fall, when the body decides if it has enough body fat to raise babies. And if the female hasn't had enough body fat put on that spring, even though she's mated, she might not actually be able to produce the babies, and she'll have to wait till next year to try again. So it's a kind of a combination of that, and really it boils down to how much food is she getting. And pregnant females that do get pregnant and do go into their dens, so they come off the sea ice in about July, and right now they'll be in their dens and they're going to give birth in a month or two. And those females don't come out of their dens until maybe about March, and so they can go for up to 8 months without eating at all. And that takes a lot of body weight to support a bear for 8 months. Plus, she's nursing her babies with the highest fat milk in the mammal world, which takes a lot of energy. So it's really just amazing what these females go through, and they need a lot of body stores of fat to make it through that. Yeah, it's quite incredible.
Now, talking about how they get the fat, Nativity of Our Lord in Warminster, Pennsylvania, USA has asked, how do the polar bears catch the seals to eat them, to gain that fat? Stefan?
Yeah. So polar bears are incredibly intelligent, and they have developed a number of different ways. So sometimes they'll wait next to cracks in the ice where seals are like all the rest of the mammals. They need to breathe air. They're not like fishes. So when they come up in these cracks, polar bears can get them. I've heard of polar bears catching seals in the water. We think that that's probably quite challenging and doesn't happen really often, but there's been reports of that. When there's complete ice and snow cover, seals will dig and maintain a breathing hole in the ice, sometimes up to 1 meter deep. And then a snowdrift will form over top of that hole in some occasions, and they'll dig a lair, and that's where they'll give birth. So polar bears will come along and pounce and break through that lair and be able to get the seal, the baby seal, or maybe the adult inside that lair. So a number of different sorts of strategies in order to get as many seals as they can throughout that feeding period that's so critical.
Mm-hmm. So that ice is central, right?
Absolutely.
We have to maintain that ice in order to do that. But now what happens if that ice, Jen, maybe you can tell us about this. What happens around the world when we start to lose the ice? Because it's not just the polar bears that appreciate having the ice on this planet.
Yeah, well, so we've talked a lot about ecosystems, and we're also part of the ecosystem as well. We're one of these top predators at the top. So changing ice conditions in the Arctic will affect us and our ability to go around in the Arctic. It also can affect things like clouds, which is something that I study in particular. So it can affect climate, and the clouds play an important role in terms of how much warming we see. But more important than the clouds, I think on the long term, it's all about us. If we want an Arctic that has sea ice and has polar bears, we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases. On the long term, that's what's going to change this ecosystem. It's really, we're at the top, and we're kind of driving the school bus here.
Or the tundra buggy.
Or the tundra buggy, right.
That's right, eh?
Yeah.
Well, and those ecosystems that are all going to be impacted about that and by the lack of ice is exactly what Mrs. Fisher's class in Indianapolis. So she shared that our ecosystem includes squirrels and cardinals, cornfields, deciduous and coniferous trees, and lakes and rivers. They want to know how long polar bears can go without eating. So thank you first for letting us know about your ecosystem and other classes around the world. You heard we have people from Italy who are here, all the way across and throughout North America, all the way down and into Mexico. We want to hear about your ecosystems, and we want again to include your questions that you have for our experts. So again, sending that to questions@pbears.org, sending that to #TundraConnections, and sending that on the chat window on the side so we can direct those questions, just like I am now to Alicia. Alicia, we learned a little bit about how those mums can last, but how long can they actually last without eating? Not just the mums, but the dads as well.
Well, it would really depend on how big the bear is. So the fatter the bear, the longer it could go without eating. Roughly, on average, a polar bear on land is burning about 1 kilogram of fat a day. So they are losing weight fairly steadily if they're not consuming anything at all. And so, a really fat bear might be able to last, months on end. Like we said, the females can last for up to 8 months. But it's really, it's not an easy thing to do that to your body. The bears want to be eating. It's not like they're just, they're adapted to it, but they are bears. I mean, they'd love to be eating the whole time, and they want to be.
I would love to be eating all the time.
Yeah, all of us could probably stand to, not eat as much, but, our body wants it. So, do you know of any, metabolic?
I don't know what the maximum is. It's not
Right.
something that a research project that
Right.
scientists
Can't
would
really test
take
that.
on. So we only know by kind of what we've observed, and we know how important even like bonanzas are. So if
Yes.
there's a dead whale on the beach, that's a great opportunity during the summer months for bears to really kind of not lose as much weight. And we also know how much effort bears during the summer take to not waste energy. So they don't, until it starts getting cold like it is now, they're trying not to move a lot. They're conserving energy however they can, and they're trying to gain resources wherever they can at the same time, because they want to be in the best condition possible when the ice forms and they can get out hunting again. It's not like if at the end of the summer you're full, you don't bother going out there. You still need to get out there. You still need to try and gain more energy. For males, the bigger you are, the better you are at maybe finding a mate, more successful. For females, the bigger you are, the more chance you could maybe have triplets. And we see across the Arctic all these different changes. So in some areas, we see populations that have more triplets. Not in Western Hudson's Bay anymore, but in the past, we did go through
In the past
times
we
where,
did, yep.
where triplets were more common than now.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, all the bears, they're looking out for number one, and number one is tied to how much weight can we gain, really.
Yeah.
So, Little Flower School in Indianapolis. We have Fies on the Fly. We have our friends joining us from Italy. I would love to know, we've talked a little bit about the top predator on the Arctic ecosystem, and you have shared just now our friends where were you? What ecosystem did you join us from? I'm going to find that in a second. But you've shared some of your... I would love to know what your top predators are on your ecosystem. So if you want to tweet that in, send that in, let us know what those are. But before we get to that, we have Mosaic World, who on the explore.org chat asked, are the winter dens underground or under snow? They said, I saw a video where it looked like the mother and cub came up from under the snow. How do they ensure another bear doesn't walk over top of the den? Because I'll tell you, when somebody walks on me or jumps on me when I'm sleeping, I'm probably not going to be sleeping anymore. So Lisa, what do? Are they underground? Are they under snow? How do they make sure someone doesn't walk on top of them?
Right. Well, it actually depends where the polar bears live in the world, what kind of dens they have. So a lot of these polar bears here, they have peat dens. So they will dig sometimes into the riverbanks, into the peat moss, and make themselves a nice little den in there. And then the snow will come and cover that over in the winter, and they'll be pretty snug. But there are absolutely bears that do dig ice dens or snow dens up in the higher Arctic. And they're pretty sturdy little, caves kind of that the mom will dig in there, and then the snow will cover that over time. And, it might be that things do walk over the den, but they might never know that there's a polar bear in there.
Yeah.
Can you add to that?
Yeah, snow is incredible. So if you had snow and then you get a howling wind for 3 or 4 days, that is almost as strong as concrete, a lot more workable, and that's why communities in the Arctic have traditionally used snow to build structures. But yeah, it can be really strong, and
very
polar
protective.
bears are really adapted for trying to smash through ring seal dens, and it takes a big polar bear. Young polar bears aren't as efficient at getting through that snow because it is so packed tightly together. And really, you can make an entire career of studying snow and studying ice, like Jen.
And
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
absolutely. And talking about ice, we just got a tweet here that says, how far does ice actually extend? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we look out our windows right now and we can see that the ice is starting to form, which is really exciting, right? So when we have, oh my goodness, do we have, did I
have a
just hear that
visitor.
we have a visitor joining us right now?
Okay.
Oh, look at that, boys and girls, off in the distance. Can you see him? Or her? I don't know. Can anybody tell? Can you tell if it's a boy or a girl?
Not from that distance.
No. Does it have a dress or pants on? No, we can't really tell. But it's out
Not
there.
every guy wears dresses.
No, that's right. Good point. Good point. So it's out there walking on the ice right now. And we had a tweet that just came in asking how far does that ice actually extend?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you're talking about sea ice, and again, that's when you freeze the ocean, this is about as far south as it comes. Like, we're actually, in the high 50s as for latitude here in Hudson Bay. So most of the sea ice in the Arctic is in the Arctic Ocean, which is further north than here.
But there would be sea ice in the Hudson Bay. So where we're looking out, there would be sea ice that would extend?
Yeah, so Hudson Bay has salt water in it, so when you freeze it, you form sea ice. So, yep, that's sea ice out there.
And the entire bay freezes over during the winter.
Yeah, and Hudson Bay is a little different too than other places in the Arctic because it only has ice during certain times of year. So during the summer, there's not ice, and we learned from Elisa, that's why the polar bears here are on land. Up in the high Arctic, so in the Arctic Ocean, there's some ice that lasts many years, so it's what we call multi-year ice. And so that ice can get thicker, and it looks a little different, but it's still sea ice. It formed initially from freezing ocean waters. So you can see there's different sea ice and different sea ice conditions for the polar bears, and that has an influence about how much time they spend on land versus on the ice itself.
Now, boys and girls, we are getting down to our last 10 minutes of this conference. So please, if you have questions that you would like to send in and talk to these world-class international researchers, what an amazing opportunity to have your question or your comment shared. Please go to that hashtag we shared with you earlier and to Tundra Connections, or send them in via email, or send them in on the chat. We're down to like 9 minutes left. So Little Flower here has a great question, because you know what? Is all the changes that are going on, are they all bad, or are there any positive changes we're seeing in the Arctic?
Oh man, there's always going to be winners and losers when things change. I think the reason that I'm concerned is just the rate of change, which is something that Elisa mentioned as well. I mean, we've always seen that our planet can change, but the time scale that happens on, we're changing it on our time scale, so human time scales. I mentioned how when I was born, there was twice as much Arctic sea ice as there was in 2012.
Twice as much Arctic sea ice?
That's not the kind of change that you can adapt to,
gracious.
really,
Yeah.
that kind of quick change. I mean, so I think that's an important thing, and one reason that I think I'm really concerned about the future of sea ice and the future of polar bears. And one thing that's also sort of cool and unique about sea ice is it's not too late, and if we actually reduce greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, the sea ice will come back. So it can form again. If it gets cold, you get more sea ice, and if it gets warm, there's less sea ice. It's a very sensitive climate indicator. But so that's sort of some good news. We have to act, but when we do act, it will be beneficial for the sea ice and for the polar bears.
So that's really good news, because I was starting to get just a little bit concerned. What are some things, what I would love to hear, boys and girls, are what are some things that you are doing in your communities to help combat climate change, and which is going to help our polar bears? Could you tell us a little bit about what these boys and girls and their families and their parents can do to help combat some of the sea ice loss that we're seeing?
So we've heard about greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and how they're sort of the main reason that we're going to see warming in the future. We're continuing to emit them. That's going to cause warming. So this is a big problem. It's a global problem, and it has global solutions. But you have to start small. So things that you do as an individual and how you influence other people can make a really big difference. So, living more sustainably, recycling, and then encouraging your neighbors to do that as well. And I'm guessing many of you are too young to vote, but encourage your parents to vote and encourage them to think about the environment when they vote and think about what your future will be like, because you'll probably be around a lot longer, and you want a good future for you and for your kids too.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there are so many things that we can do. It's just important that we are active and we're actually doing them. Now, talking about what people are doing and what actually found in their backyards, we have Ms. Fisher's class in Indianapolis who shared with us that their top predators include coyotes, foxes, hawks, and catfish. Really? Catfish? I would never have thought of catfish as a top predator. Maybe you can explain to me in that chat window how exactly it's a top predator. Now, what other animals, like these ones that we have heard here, I'm going to pass this over to Stefan, what other animals are being affected by global warming?
Yeah, our focus is kind of the Arctic, and my research is looking at kind of ring seals and harbor seals and how there might be winners and losers there. But throughout the world, we have similar systems of connected animals that might be changing and are changing, and in ways that aren't necessarily intuitive. We don't necessarily think about, a rise in temperature may push animals that are adapted to, the mountains further up, and then they'll become more separated and more likely to become inbred or smaller population sizes. And there's all these really incredible interactions that need research and need more kind of smart minds getting at them and trying to figure out what's happening and what we might be able to do to reduce the risk for those populations.
Yep.
I always come back to the Arctic because I love the Arctic and I love the ring seals and the harbor seals, but we expect harbor seals to increase because they're not really adapted to sea ice, so less sea ice is better for them. But ring seals, who are really adapted to sea ice, they might not be doing as well in the future. And polar bears love ring seals. So.
They do.
Maybe not love.
It's a love-hate relationship.
Love-hate, I would eat you for dinner relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, we are down to just our last couple of minutes, and we are just seeing the comments fly in here. I want to acknowledge first off what Flies on the Fly shared about what they're doing to help save the polar bears. We walked to the grocery store today as a family and carried everything home in reusable bags instead of driving. Way to go! That's a great thing to do. Let's continue to send those in, guys, and let's continue to say how we can help change the planet. Now, Morgan sent in this question here, and I'm going to pass this over to Jen. Morgan asked, how many different types of ice are there, and does it change in depth, and how do you classify ice types? That's a great question.
Yeah, Morgan, we should chat offline because
Yeah.
I can talk to you for probably 45 minutes about this.
Are you looking for more PhD students by chance?
Yeah,
Jen?
my group is looking for some
Are
students.
you excellent?
Morgan,
Well,
so-
Morgan, head on over there to Colorado.
I think another distinction, we've talked about sea ice, so that's the ice that forms from freezing the ocean. Another type of ice that's really important is glacier ice. So that's something like Greenland or Antarctica, or if you live in the mountains, sometimes you'll see glaciers up in the mountains. So the two things you need to be glacier ice, you need to be made of ice, right?
Okay, yep.
And you
makes
need
sense.
to move. So
Okay.
evidence that you're moving could come from like cracks and crevasses, things like that. But glacier ice is very different than sea ice because when you put glacier ice into the ocean, it causes sea levels to rise. Whereas sea ice is already floating in the ocean, so it doesn't change the level of the ocean. So that's another important distinction between those two different types of ice, and it's something that people often get confused. They think, oh, melting sea ice is going to cause sea level rise. And actually, sea ice is already floating in the ocean, so it's not going to cause sea level rise.
Great, now we have a tweet that just came in from, it's just coming across the line right now, Independence Elementary, who's joining us from Missouri, and they shared how their ecosystem includes forests. And they have a question that I'm going to pass over to Elisa, and they said, do polar bears have to travel farther to find food? Great question, Missouri.
Question. So we think that that's going to happen more. As the sea ice freezes and as it's warmer out there, we expect and we are seeing a lot more sea ice fragmentation. So we're seeing sea ice that's moving around more rather than just one solid block. So a great analogy that Cecilia Bitz said last week was think of a cup of hot chocolate and throw a few marshmallows in there.
Oh, I love hot
and
chocolate.
watch those marshmallows have lots of space to move, and they're going to move around quite a bit because there's not a lot. And that's like some melting sea ice. Whereas if we had a regular sheet of sea ice, just shove a bunch of marshmallows in there and see how they stick in their one solid platform of marshmallows. So when we have just a few marshmallows or slightly less sea ice that can move more, polar bears are having to navigate this moving sea ice more, and it's a little bit exhausting because they might be walking one way, but the ice they're on is moving the other way, and it's this increased travel time, and that's going to make it harder to find mates, as well as harder to find prey. And so we do expect that, you know, there will be bigger movements, and depending on what's happening throughout the year, so sometimes if it's not a great year for seals, so if seal reproduction has been lower, polar bears might have to travel quite a bit farther to find enough seals to sustain themselves. So yeah, there's a lot of levels to that question, but absolutely we think that will be one of the repercussions to the changing environment.
Well, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, our time has come to an end. I just had such a wonderful time. I have learned so much, and I hope that I'm sure you have done the same. I want to acknowledge one last piece here from Nativity of Our Lord in Warminster. They say that they save electricity by shutting off lights, fans, and computers when they are not in use. Excellent, excellent job. Ladies and gentlemen, the goal of Polar Bear International is to keep polar bears in the Arctic always. It's important to remember that time remains for polar bears to be saved and for their ice habitat to be saved as well. And we can all do our part to help make that happen. So first off, thank you for the things you are already doing, like lowering your thermostat, riding your bike, reducing your electronic device time, increasing your outdoor time, getting your families to vote with your family dollars in support of companies that have sustainable business plans, and then vote at the ballot box for policy leaders who support climate change action, as well as using local farm stores and places like that. We have heard today how many of you are doing great things, and we need to keep doing those everyday actions. But we're sure you're wondering, what else can you do? So, ladies and gentlemen, we just finished our Polar Bear Week here. And we want to encourage all of you to go online and to sign our petition for polar bears, which asks world leaders to take action on climate change. Then take the next step by pledging to additional energy-saving actions. Register for Project Polar Bear and develop a community page that reduces carbon dioxide load in the atmosphere. Also, check out the links to our teacher resources for each webcast on the Tundra Connections page for more information and materials in your classroom. To help you further, one of the partners in this that I'm here because of is Taking It Global, and they've created a ton of online resources as well for individuals and teachers, from the online and mobile tool called Commit to Act, which is available on Android and iPhone, and which will allow you to track your actions while sharing them with your family and friends. Each action, from having a mealtime free of meat to committing to using reusable mugs instead of a water bottle, can be recorded, tracked, and used to challenge friends and family. And remember, these actions have a huge impact when they're scaled up. For example, if every house in the United States and Canada alone switched one light bulb to an Energy Star light bulb, we would save enough energy to light 3 million homes a year. So take a big step for polar bears by inviting your friends and family to become members to join you. And finally, please remember to visit Tundra Connections page on our website and take our post-broadcast survey. Participants will be entered into a draw to win a free polar bear adoption. So cool! Ladies and gentlemen, our heartfelt thanks to everyone who helped make today happen. To Julene Reed, an Apple Distinguished Educator and PB Education Advisory Council member who directs the PBI Tundra Connection program, and to our platinum sponsors, Frontier North, Tundra Buggy Adventure, and Canada Goose. Support also has been provided by Pearls of the Planet, a project of Explore.org, a direct charitable activity of the Annenberg Foundation. We're also grateful to Telestream, makers of Wirecast, Parks Canada, Discovery Education, the Center for Global Education, and Taking It Global. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so very much for joining us, and let's continue to save our ice. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.